No mai haere mai, and welcome to the Exchange Cafe. We're fortunate today to have Jonathan Boston with us, who's going to speak to us about New Zealand's adaptation journey. Jonathan, it's lovely to meet you. We haven't had a chance to speak previously, but I understand you have an important role and background in supporting New Zealand's climate change adaptation journey.
Well, kia ora, Shannon. Thank you for this opportunity to chat about a really important issue facing the global community and, of course, the local community in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's my pleasure to be with you. By way of background, Shannon, I'm a policy generalist. I'm now sort of towards the end of my academic career. I stood down as a professor of public policy at Victoria University a couple of years ago, but I'm continuing to work fairly intensively, particularly on adaptation issues. And in recent years, I've been a member of the expert working group for the Ministry for the Environment on a study of managed retreat or planned relocation of people in the face of particularly sea level rise. I've also assisted the Environmental Defence Society with their project on climate change adaptation, which produced a whole series of working papers and a final report. And I'm currently in the United Kingdom talking to people in business, government and the academic community about issues related to climate change adaptation, particularly planned relocation in the face of more severe flooding and sea level rise, but also issues around the future of residential property insurance, which is going to be an increasingly critical issue as we face more and more serious impacts from climate change.
Yeah, I read one of your papers today, and a significant amount of background detail and also comparatives of previous policy that allowed for significant government intervention versus the unknown that we have to date. It's wonderful to have someone who's got so much insight in this area and looking specifically at Te Tairaki at the moment. How aware and prepared do you think New Zealand is for the impacts of climate change? And what are the key challenges now and in the future?
All right, well, I think there's a growing awareness of how climate change is affecting the wider world, but also Aotearoa, and clearly the very significant severe weather events during 2023 helped alert people to just what the future is going to look like. In other words, last year, 2023, we had something like 17 declarations of states of emergency, all due to severe weather events. So there was, several cyclones. We had torrential rain in various parts of the country on a number of occasions and so forth. Huge amount of damage done. Estimates perhaps up to $15 billion in terms of economic costs and at least $4 billion in insurance losses. And that affected, as you appreciate, people living in towns and cities, the rural community. It affected businesses and farmers and horticulturalists. It affected, in effect, lots and lots of people in different ways of life. And I think that's drawn attention to the kind of impacts that climate change is going to have, particularly in terms of flooding and severe wind events and so on. Sea level rise is something that's going to be increasingly on the horizon, and over the course of the coming century will probably come to dominate the property damage that climate change will inflict, both globally and locally. So I think the first point to say is events are helping to inform people about the severity of what climate change can do and will do in the future. How prepared are we? Difficult to say precisely, Shannon. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on at the national, regional, and local levels of government. And obviously, also many businesses are also preparing for the impacts of climate change. People in the agricultural industry, of course, are aware of the kinds of changes that are occurring in terms of the climatic impacts on the kinds of crops so that they can grow and changing seasons and so on. So at various levels, governmental, business, community, and so on, people are beginning to prepare. But we've got a long way to go. So we currently have at the national level a national adaptation plan, but many of the provisions in that plan have yet to be properly implemented. We have currently the Finance and Expenditure Committee of our Parliament, which is in effect the premier committee of the Parliament, undertaking an inquiry on climate change adaptation and its implications. And that will be looking, among other things, at the report that those of us involved in the expert working group helped prepare last year, and the work of many others across the nation, people at the in the research community, such as my colleague Judy Lawrence and Ilan Noy and so on, people at the subnational level, regional and local government, people in community organizations, obviously iwi, hapu and so on, who have been undertaking work and thinking about how they're going to have to adjust to the impacts of climate change. So that committee is underway. Its submissions are due within the next 2 weeks or so, and it's due to report later this year. I'm not sure precisely when, I think in September, but I'm doubtful that they would meet that kind of deadline. There's a huge number of issues to address. And then at the the regional and local levels, various councils have been undertaking risk assessments. The Wellington region has just had a report published looking at the impacts of climate change on Wellington City and the Wellington region, and that has some pretty grim material in it. So lots going on. I think the final point I just want to make on this topic of preparation is that what we are facing as a human species and at a sort of national and local level in New Zealand is unprecedented, Shannon. Humanity has never had to deal with multi-meter sea level rise over relatively short periods of time, as looks increasingly likely over the coming century and beyond. And that is going to have an enormous impact on how we live and where we live. And preparing for that in a precautionary, proactive way is going to be extremely challenging. And happy to say more about that as we go through this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the key to the conversation, isn't it? Is adaptation does look like change, and as you say, well, it seemed to be a term that was getting overworn, saying that things were unprecedented in recent times, but we do continue to go through unprecedented events. And as you say, so the submissions for that inquiry, I believe, close on the 16th of this month, which is so anyone who wants to get their 2 cents in should do it as soon as possible. I guess, do you think that the recent coalition government's decisions are going to be aiding the impacts of climate change, or do you think that there's sort of regressive policy coming in place?
Well, I think there's a mix of both. I mean, on the issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or what's called mitigation, various steps that the government has taken over the last 6 or 7 months are going to reduce the effort that people put into reducing emissions. So other things being equal, we're likely to have as a country higher greenhouse gas emissions than would otherwise have been the case, sadly. So, for example, they removed the subsidy for people buying electric cars and the, if you like, the tax that was placed on high emitting vehicles. Well, by doing that, we know already there's been a very substantial reduction in the number of people buying low emission vehicles and an increase in the people buying high emission vehicles. Well, that can only be a bad thing in terms of New Zealand's emissions path over the coming years. So that's unfortunate. Having said that, what New Zealand does to reduce emissions is going to have a minimal effect on the kinds of impacts that New Zealand faces from climate change. I mean, even if New Zealand eliminated all its greenhouse gas emissions from human activity right now and forever, the impact, say, on sea level rise would be barely measurable. It would be in the sort of perhaps 1 millimeter over a century or something of that vicinity. So while it's unfortunate in terms of New Zealand not contributing appropriately to the global effort to reduce emissions, the actions of the current government are not going to actually affect the kinds of impacts that we face. Now, on the adaptation side of things, I think the position the government is taking is probably somewhat more positive. It has, for example, concluded that we need a multi-party agreement of some kind on the way forward for adaptation, and thus it has affirmed the role of Parliament in seeking to build that kind of multi-party agreement through, in this case, the work of the Finance and Expenditure Committee. Previously, the previous government had arranged an inquiry by the Environment Committee, and that inquiry has been shifted to the Finance and Expenditure Committee. And in some ways, that's positive because the Finance and Expenditure Committee has many of Parliament's, if you like, heavy hitters on it, and most of the really serious issues that need to be addressed are financial issues. So the fact that it's the Finance Committee of our Parliament that's focused on this issue now, I think is a good thing, and I would commend the government on that. Also, in the budget, the government agreed to provide several $100 million to assist regional councils and local governments in relation to flood protection measures. That was something that the local government community had been seeking, and that's positive. Having said that, the amount of money involved is small relative to the amount that we're going to need over the coming years and decades if we're going to adapt. And I suppose one of my concerns would be that if we have years of fiscal stringency in a context where the government is not wanting to spend much money because it's wanting to reduce the role of the state in order to perhaps to continue to reduce taxes over time, then potentially we won't, as a community, have the resources we need to do the sort of preemptive, proactive, precautionary investments that we need to make. So I think it's going to be really important over the coming years that the whole community at multiple levels, including iwi and hapu and so forth, advocate strongly for the government investing appropriately, cost effectively in adaptation measures, and not being stingy with its funding because of its desire, perhaps on a philosophical basis, to reduce the role of the state.
Yeah, I think you said something in there that that struck a nerve with me a little bit, which is that if we were to remove all of our greenhouse gas emissions now, then we'd only reduce the sea level rise by 1 millimeter, say. But to put that in context, I think New Zealand has always been world leaders in many respects, and if I was to ask counterparts from around the world, what are we famous for? Well, we're famous for great policy. We were famous for giving women the right to vote first. If we're going to show leadership and do something brave and bold and be first, then surely this is the world's largest challenge to be first at right now.
Yes, well, I'd say New Zealand does have a record of doing some tremendously positive things in terms of public policy over 150 years or more. And it would be great if New Zealand could really be on the front foot when it comes to climate change adaptation. But I mean, just sorry to say, Shannon, other countries are already somewhat ahead of us. Perhaps not many, but some. So, for example, just to give a few cases, the Dutch have been investing in protecting themselves from floods and the sea for hundreds, if not thousands, of years.
Yeah, I mean, they're 4 meters below sea level for the whole country, right?
Fiji, not far from New Zealand, has had an adaptation strategy in place involving the potential relocation of 450 villages on the coasts. It's had that policy in place for a number of years now, and has already begun the process of moving some of the vulnerable villages. And if you appreciate, Fiji is not a wealthy country, and it's not a country with significant capacity to do things, but it's begun the journey. The United States, to take a very large and wealthy jurisdiction, has had a strategy in place for removing residential and commercial properties out of harm's way, primarily due to flooding, for 40 or 50 years. And they have moved tens and tens of thousands of properties out of harm's way. And in recent years, indeed under the Trump administration, they put in place a strategy called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRICS, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, in which they are now moving from, if you like, a reactive strategy of moving people after they've been flooded to a proactive strategy of moving people in advance of harm from flooding or sea level rise. Still a small strategy at this point in the US, only perhaps a few $1 billion of expenditure, but moving in the right direction. Now, if New Zealand is really going to provide leadership here, and we could, then I can only but point to the recommendations of the expert working group that I was part of, which set out dozens of recommendations about how New Zealand could devise a really first-rate and hopefully cost-effective strategy for addressing the challenges we're going to face over the coming decades and beyond. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But there's a strategy there. It's not perfect, and it's by no means complete, but it's the beginnings of a framework. And if we were to adopt something like that, well, then we would be certainly among the world leaders. We might not have been the first to kind of get there, but we would be among the first, and we could be a model for many others to follow. Whether we can do that, well, we'll have to wait and see. I remain hopeful, but not how can I put it, hugely optimistic.
I mean, I guess that's that's what we'll be looking for in terms of the outcome from this climate adaptation inquiry. I assume you're really looking for some of those initiatives to trickle down through that and that maintain their veracity, I guess, or maintain their purpose. Is that what? Tell me more about what you'd like to see from this.
Yes. Okay. So if I was just to quickly outline the sort of key issues that we need to address and the kinds of things that we could do. So first of all, we need to have a very clear assessment of the risks that we face. Now, we already have a climate change risk assessment, which was prepared under the leadership of the Ministry for the Environment some years ago. There's another one now being prepared by the Climate Change Commission. And that's great at the national level, but then we will need risk assessments at the subnational level, at the regional and local levels. And our expert working group recommended a kind of way of doing that. So the first thing is we need to assess risk, and we need to be able to decide through very rigorous debate and clear criteria the circumstances in which it's going to be cost effective to move people out of harm's way rather than, say, trying to protect people, which in some cases may be viable, in others it may not. So that's the first thing, risk assessment. The second is having a planning framework that enables the community to be heavily involved in the decisions that are made about if and when they need to move, if they do need to move, and where they might move to. And we need, in that context, bespoke arrangements for Māori communities based on a range of principles derived from the treaty and so forth. And so we need a whole package of measures there on community participation, planning processes, and so forth. Then thirdly, and this is the really tricky bit, we're going to have funding mechanisms that help pay for people to move. That, in my view, will need to include compensation for property loss, at least for some residential property owners, and possibly also for some commercial property owners. We've also got to have funding to improve infrastructure so that it's more resilient in the face of climate change, but also to move infrastructure in the face of sea level rise, because lots of our infrastructure is on the coast. So that's the sort of the third thing, that the funding side, really difficult because nobody really wants to bear the burden, and there's going to be a substantial cost. Fourth will be implementing the adaptation approaches that are adopted in an effective way. So we may need some new institutional arrangements. And then finally, but by no means last, we're going to have to rethink our property insurance arrangements. We're now faced with the prospect of more and more people finding it extremely hard, if not impossible, to afford to insure their properties properly. Insurance premiums have gone up by 100% in the last 8 or 9 years, about 30% last year alone. So that's a serious issue. And then, of course, there's going to be insurance retreat. Insurers are going to be moving out of providing insurance cover for high-risk properties. And so we've got to deal with that problem of unavailability of insurance and unaffordability of insurance. So there's sort of 5 key issues that we're going to have to work through, and I'm hoping the committee will. So summarizing: risk, sort of planning, funding, implementation, insurance. And we need a comprehensive integrated package where all the parts fit together coherently and are kind of reinforcing each other rather than pulling apart. And this is going to be really difficult. So we mustn't underestimate the challenge intellectually, if you like, but also politically. And the politics of this are not good because, unfortunately, in the face of an oncoming tide, lots of people are not going to want to move, even if they're bought out. And we've witnessed this already, with post-disaster issues. But if we're going to move people out of harm's way before they're flooded, that's going to be all the harder, because people will often disagree with the scientific assessments. They won't accept the risk analyses that are undertaken. They will want to be protected rather than have to move, even if protection is more expensive, etc., etc. So we can talk more about these issues, but let's not underestimate the challenge.
Oh, I don't underestimate the challenge whatsoever. And I think even there, so if you were to talk about the current state and recent funding announcement for recovery from the cyclone, so $1 billion plus allocated to the affected regions. Now, I question the how far that's going to go to adaptation. The majority of that, the vast majority of that, is going to roading. One can,
and it's repairs rather than building a more resilient infrastructure. Yeah.
Yes, and as you say, we have a lot of infrastructure on the coast at the moment, but the majority of our home ownership damage and the majority of our infrastructure damage wasn't coastal. It was,
that's right.
It was hinterland. It was waterway, near waterways. It was it's bridges. So actually the problem now isn't just sea level rise, it's all of the cause and effect that is occurring.
Absolutely, Shannon. And I should have said, look, right now and for several decades into the future, the big issues in terms of the impacts of climate change are going to be really around flooding, but also erosion and slips, and to some extent fire and wind. But as the century goes on, sea level rise will become an ever-increasing problem. And at some point, I don't know exactly when, but at some point this century, the damage that will be inflicted on property and infrastructure from sea level rise will begin to exceed that impacted from particularly river flooding and related high intensity rain events. So right now, you're absolutely right. The big issue is inland riverine flooding, pluvial flooding, erosion, and landslips and so on, rather than coastal erosion and inundation. But that will change over time, assuming the broad sort of scientific understanding of what's happening globally is true, and that essentially means what we're faced with is the increasingly rapid melting of the big ice sheets on the planet, particularly the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet, and that will over time accelerate sea level rise and will do significant coastal damage. The other thing I should have said earlier, and this is something I don't think most people understand, is that 40% of the coastline of the country is subsiding, and subsiding at rates between around 2 centimeters a decade or 20 centimeters a century, and around 6, 7, even 8 centimeters a decade, or up to 80 centimeters a century. And that subsidence will, of course, compound the problem of sea level rise. So in some extreme cases, if we were, for example, to have up to a meter of sea level rise by the end of the century, or by 2120 or 2150 or something like that, subsidence will, in some cases, magnify that by 50% or more.
Yeah, it's
and unfortunately, lots of people are living in areas of the country where subsidence is occurring.
Yeah, and I think that's the scary picture, which we haven't been presented with yet. Is when you look at a flood-prone map or a tsunami map, for example, and you see the quantity of the coastal area that is potentially inundated in a tsunami. We don't have a map like that for sea level rise that's presented to us on the website every day and said, this is the large block of homes that will be underwater. We think, okay, it's all those nice beachfront houses, boo-hoo them. But we don't understand that it's thousands, if not tens of thousands of properties, right?
Absolutely. And look, we don't know yet exactly how much sea level rise we're going to have or the pace of that. What we do know is we're going to have sea level rise. That will be dependent partly on the extent to which the global community reduces greenhouse gas emissions over the coming decades, and the extent to which we can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through direct air capture or whatever. But on even a low emissions pathway for the global community, which looks increasingly unlikely, we should assume around half a meter of sea level rise by the end of the century, and on a high emissions pathway, a meter or more. So, and sea level rise won't stop in 2100 unless we can cool the planet in a dramatic way for an extended period. Even then, I'm not sure that we'd be able to prevent sea level rise within a century or so, from what the scientific evidence suggests. So we know the general direction. Coming to the issue of maps and so on, Shannon, well, there is increasing use of visualization sort of techniques where you can, depending on the amount of sea level rise, highlight the areas of towns and cities and communities that are going to be affected. And that is that kind of information is available, for many of the cities in New Zealand already. But I'm not sure that we have a map for the whole country yet. It may be someone in NIWA has done that. I'm not sure, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah,
and it would of course have to be. You would have to adjust
after the chat, and if we've got it, we'll link it below.
Would have to adjust for the amount of sea level rise, because obviously that's going to have a big impact. But even a modest amount of sea level rise, say half a meter, is going to be very damaging to many coastal communities, not least because of the problem of subsidence as well. And also, many of our stormwater systems are gravity-based rather than reliant upon pumps. And in many cases, we've already had 20 centimeters of sea level rise in the last century or so. Those gravity-based stormwater systems are going to become increasingly vulnerable as you get, 20, 30, 40 centimeters of sea level rise, so that there will be more flooding inland in high precipitation events, because the higher sea level will simply prevent the water flowing out as quickly as it otherwise would.
I assume that that also has a broader impact on groundwater levels as well.
Absolutely.
Which
yes,
means that
and that's already
the
evident.
areas that we saw this year when we've had heavy rain events, and last year when we've had heavy rain events that just stayed wet for months on end, they'll be lakes.
That's right. Yes, and absolutely. So it won't be people just right on the coast, right on the sort of beachfront that are affected. In many areas, people who are, 1 or more kilometers away from the coast will be affected by higher water tables and increasing inundation. So you think of the, the Hauraki Plains, or you think about, say, an area like South Dunedin. People who are, maybe half a kilometer or a kilometer away from the coast are going to be affected by increased higher water tables, and then nuisance flooding at high tide or king tides and so on. So all that is, of course, happening around the world. It's not just in New Zealand. And many parts of the world are going to be more severely afflicted than we are, particularly the big delta areas on the planet, areas like the Ganges Delta, Bangladesh, India, the Mekong Delta, South Vietnam area, the big deltas in China, the United States, South America, and so on. So, some big impacts. Now, I'm sorry, I've probably not answered the question, Shannon. I'm not sure what that one was.
We could dive into potential effects all night long, I'm sure, because when you start going down that rabbit hole, it's quite scary.
Yes.
And I guess
yes.
So the phrase "the cavalry isn't coming" has become increasingly common, certainly in relation to recovery planning here. What are the key things you would like New Zealand communities to be aware of, and what should they be asking or demanding of their local authorities, iwi, economic development agencies? What are we knocking on their doors for?
Yes, well, there's a huge number of things that one could mention in this context, Shannon. So let me try and be brief about it. I mean, the first thing to say is obviously, my heart goes out to all those people who've been affected by recent major flood events, not least in Tairāwhiti, Hawke's Bay, and so on, in your part of the world. And we need, as a community, as a nation, to ensure that people can be assisted to recover, to restore things that are damaged and broken, and where necessary, because the risks are very high, to move people out of harm's way so that they don't get severely afflicted again. And of course, that work is underway. It's probably going to be never enough, but recovery and restoration is really important. Having said that, we need to avoid a situation in which we're so focused on responding to severe weather events and their impacts that we don't invest enough in precaution and preparation and prevention. So, a key message I would want to try and communicate to politicians at all levels, and the business community, the wider community, iwi, hapu, and so on, is that we need to be on the front foot here. We need to recognize what's coming at us from the future, and we need to prepare wisely and soberly and thoughtfully and cost effectively. Now, there's a lot that we're going to need to do, and we're going to have to prioritize. I appreciate there's funding is always going to be limited, but we need to ensure that we are investing and investing quite significantly in the preparation side of things. Otherwise, the risk is that we'll be spending all our money simply on responding to and recovering from the latest disaster, and we'll be getting further and further behind in the process of trying to build resilience and prevent future damage. Now, in terms of what we should be doing, obviously, in some situations, we need to be enhancing the protection that's available to minimize flooding. But for a whole variety of reasons, there will be many, many situations where simply building higher and higher stop banks or whatever isn't going to be sensible, and where we're going to have to create more space for rivers to flood. So making room for rivers is one of the things we're going to do. We're obviously going to have to invest heavily in trying to minimize soil erosion and slips in areas like your own, so that we don't have vast amounts of silt coming down every time it rains heavily, and the damage that does to infrastructure. So there's a whole issue there around being sensible in terms of our investment in land use and land use planning, reforestation, maximizing biodiversity, which means we need to be planting plenty of native trees and shrubs and so on, not just Pinus radiata, etc., etc. You know all about that. But then I would say we also need to be
it's almost
identifying...
worth stressing though before we go on, right? That's almost worth stressing before we go on, because you talk about we talk about the adaptation elements of that and soil erosion, and particularly on our coast here, this is one element that the can wasn't kicked down the road, right? There was policy in place. There were planting schemes. Pinus radiata was the chosen solution, and specifically as a response to erosion and sediment coming down the river. They were predicting that every 25 to 35 years they would have to elevate the bridges to accommodate the sediment levels if they didn't do the planting, and instead, in that same time frame, the trees grew and then came down and smashed the bridges they were paying to protect. So it's not just making sure there's policy. And as you know, there's a citizens' assembly to be held here. Where is the brains trust that will come up with the policy that will work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of issues here, and I'm not an expert on forestry and land use management. There are others who know infinitely more about this, and of course, there was an inquiry led by Hekia Parata after the terrible damage that slash did in your part of Aotearoa. What's obvious is that the land use management has been very poor, that the policies that previous governments have developed have not been properly implemented. There hasn't been adequate enforcement, let alone sort of prosecutions of people for failing to do what they're meant to do legally. The issues of slash are clearly really serious, and they've got to be addressed. Now, forgive me, I'm not up to speed with exactly what both the central government and local governments are doing in relation to the issues around slash at the moment. That's not one of my areas of expertise, but it's obvious that we have to have vastly better land use management as one of the many things we need to do to minimize the impacts of climate change in the future. And that will cost. I mean, both publicly and privately, if we're going to do it properly, Shannon, and that's absolutely vital. And it's a tragedy what's happened in many parts of the country as a result of poor land use management. So, while we have a government at the moment that seems to want to, how can I put it, emphasize property rights and reducing the regulatory role of the state in this area, my view is actually we need to be enhancing the regulatory role of the state to minimize future damage to all manner of things, including nature itself. So that's absolutely crucial. But the other thing which I would want to emphasize is that we also need to, as I mentioned before, put in place a national policy framework that will enable communities to begin to prepare where it's needed to move out of harm's way. And that will be obviously mostly coastal communities looking out decades and beyond. But there will be also cases where it's going to be sensible to move communities that are at high flood risk from rivers, where it's simply not going to be cost effective to protect them. And perhaps another thing that's really important to stress in this regard is that, you know, we have quite low density settlements in New Zealand compared with, say, Europe, where I am at the moment. And as a result, whereas where you've got a large number of people living in a small area, it may be cost effective to protect through various sort of flood defenses. Where you've got very sparsely populated areas, it's not necessarily going to be cost effective. So the nature of your settlement pattern, the density of the settlements and so on is going to be one of the factors that's going to be relevant. The other thing which is critical is that, you know, we suffer in New Zealand from all manner of natural hazards, not least earthquakes, and that also affects the circumstances in which protection may be technically feasible and prudent. So, for example, Wellington Central Business District is going to be vulnerable to sea level rise by the end of the century, if not earlier, and certainly into the next century. I've wondered about the possibility of building a dike, you know, to protect the Central Business District. But I'm told that any hard structure built on the harbour would run the risk of suffering from liquefaction under it in the event of a major earthquake. And in that event, you would have the risk of both an earthquake that does a lot of damage and a tsunami as the flood protection structure collapses as a result of liquefaction. So the Netherlands, for example, doesn't have to worry about that, at least not to the same extent that we do. So they can rely on dikes in a way. In New Zealand, in most cases, it's not going to be prudent to do so.
Wow. So that's what you think households and communities need to be planning for, is planning to move.
In some cases, absolutely. And this is where it's going to be really, really important that there are the opportunities for, well, first of all, that we need a national policy framework that's sensible and integrated and cost effective and so on. And at least the bare bones of that are laid out in this report that I mentioned. But we also need at the local level leadership by community leaders, you know, across all the relevant communities, taking an active role in highlighting what the likely long-term risks are going to be to their communities, and then thinking about how we can best respond to those risks. We need, in other words, a situation in which there is genuine leadership, where people are willing to take the science and the evidence seriously, rather than be sort of willfully blind, and where we need the kind of processes and structures for serious community discussions, deliberation of the kind that I know your and colleagues are involved in, with creating citizens' assemblies, other kinds of deliberative mechanisms that will enable people to calmly and thoughtfully, with good evidence, consider what the best options are for the long term for their communities. And I appreciate this is going to be, you know, this is going to be a very long journey, Shannon. We're going to have to think about this in a multi-generational way, the problems are not going to go away. They're simply going to become more and more serious. This is going to be very challenging psychologically and emotionally and culturally. We're going to lose many things that people value. I mean, most people value where they live, their place, but they also value where their relatives are buried, urupa and so on. They value their maraes, they value their community facilities, they value their farms, you know, and the land that they have inhabited in some cases for hundreds and hundreds of years, in the case of Maori communities that are on the coast. And we're going to have to come to terms with loss. And that is going to be very, very difficult. But we need to be able to come to terms with that and help facilitate the kinds of conversations that are going to be needed, and also a just transition, which is something I should have mentioned earlier. It's really important that we have fairness in this, a just transition to a different world.
Yes, it certainly is a different world. I can say from recent time as being a district councillor here, we're certainly building infrastructure in places that we potentially shouldn't be. You know, everything at council's got a 50 to 100 year life you're sort of building for, and the reality is that you sweat that asset for as long as you possibly can. So they typically last their lifespan. It's going to be a challenge to take it serious enough early enough to put that key infrastructure in the right place, open up new land blocks, make the attractive purchase the house that's safe from climate change instead of the house that's cheap.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of changes to be had.
Yes, including trying to avoid further construction of homes and businesses and infrastructure in areas that are clearly going to be at risk this century, unless those structures are easy to move. So, you know, you can readily imagine situations in which perhaps various structures can be put in place, knowing that in 30 or 50 or 100 years they will need to be moved. But probably best to build where you're not going to have to move things. Not least because wherever you build, there's going to have to be some kind of infrastructure to support those buildings, whether it's roading or, you know, sewage, other water infrastructure, electricity, and so on. And so stopping foolish developments in areas that we know already are flood prone or a significant risk of coastal erosion, clearly, it's going to be wise to do that. But then we're going to have to come to terms with where we already have infrastructure and homes and dwellings and marae and so on. So, Shannon, I'm not sure if we've kind of covered most of what's relevant here. I haven't. I was going to ask for any final thoughts. Well, I just want to say. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for this opportunity to have a chat, Shannon. And I appreciate that, you know, the kind of material that we've been talking about is hard. This is not something that any of us welcome. But, you know, we need to be realistic. We need to take the scientific evidence and projections seriously and grapple with them and think very carefully about how we need to respond, and that's at the individual level, iwi and hapu level, at the wider community level, regional level, national level, and so on, for businesses, for farmers, and so on. And we need to recognize, as I've indicated, this is going to be a long journey, an ongoing journey, and we need to be mindful of that. We need to support each other in all this. Lots of people are going to need a lot of help. And that means, among other things, we need, in my view, a moderately generous kind of national funding framework that is going to facilitate people being able to move, and particularly assistance to people whose primary places of residence are at risk. I'm not so concerned about people's second, third, and fourth homes, but we need to ensure that people are housed, and that means we need to ensure that people who are going to face losing their primary place of residence or principal place of residence are assisted to move, and that's going to require public compensation from somewhere, probably the central government, because I don't see local government having the resources to do that. We're going to have to try and ensure that we have the institutions of democracy that we need to have the conversations and debates and hard decision-making that's required. So that takes us into the whole area of the politics of this, the kind of institutional arrangements we have, and the capacity of our democracy to cope with what is going to be an unprecedented set of challenges. And my hope is that if we put in place the kind of framework we need at the national level, that will assist in enabling our democratic institutions to manage these challenges. If we don't have the relevant kind of policy framework, then my fear is there will be a loss of confidence in democratic institutions and processes. And we know what the consequences of autocracy and autocratic government, fascist governments are, and they're not nice. So, we need to do our very, very best to, if you like, protect our future interests and the interests of future generations, which includes protecting our democratic processes and institutions. So that's probably enough from me, Shannon. Good to talk. I wish you well and your colleagues in the work that you're doing and the challenges that you face. I appreciate it's been probably a hard road over the last year in particular. And I just hope that there's going to be the kind of support nationally for the communities that are afflicted over the coming years, because that's going to be really important in terms of ensuring a just way forward, and a way that people feel that they are adequately supported.
Ngā mihi nui, Jonathan. It's been fantastic speaking with you. I think that you underestimate the fact that you are part of that support structure that is coming to help us face these challenges. And we do appreciate it. It's wonderful to have your insight this evening. And all the best with your trip in Europe. And I can't wait to meet you in person when you're back. Okay. Well, I'd love to come. And see the good work you folk are doing in Tairāwhiti. So that'd be wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Joe. Good night. All the best.